Well, everybody, welcome back from lunch. Hopefully you enjoyed that delicious meal over there. So this morning we started out by talking about what the foundational issues are with starting up data protection programs. We migrated towards basically talking about the appropriate uses and protections that the possibilities are out there in terms of handling the data, and frankly, I don't know if Ken is still here, but some of the stuff he said was downright sobering about some of the issues, especially in terms of litigation and protection on how the data is used. I think that makes a perfect segue for this next panel, which is being run by a good friend of mine, Captain Chuck Hogeman, who also serves as ALPA's National Safety Chairman. He also sits on the SIAS Exec Board. And now we're going to start talking about some of the possibilities of developing effective mitigation strategies using this very, very potent tools that you have through data aggregation. So over to you, Chuck.
Thank you, Captain Cassidy, and good afternoon. I come away with the same impression, Sean, as far as some of the presentations this morning where we talk about non-punitive just culture programs and how data should be used, and more importantly how it should not be used. And it just brings to mind that this is fragile. Just culture is fragile, data collection is fragile, and our sharing of data is fragile, and it's going to be up to all of us in this room and many of our colleagues to help protect that. I'm encouraged, having been in the airline industry for quite a while, that we have finally moved off of being satisfied with, what not to do. And we have finally moved into what should we be doing. So I'd like to spend the next several minutes discussing how we develop useful information and use that information to make our aviation safety programs more effective, certainly in a proactive sense. I like to think of safety management, and a lot of what all of us in this room do, is safety management's like an engine. And that engine runs on fuel, and the fuel is the data that we are collecting. And in the same sense, the oil system is our just culture. And it's that just culture that keeps all those moving parts moving smoothly. There is wide-ranging consensus that organizations must provide their employees who perform safety-related activities a non-punitive environment where people are not fearful of reporting hazards or errors, even their own. Organizations must learn from their own mistakes as well as the ones from individuals. They must frequently review processes, procedures, and policies to ensure that proper risk mitigations are put into place. Once that environment is present, then we can indulge ourselves in a discussion of how we use that high-quality data. So that's what we're going to do this afternoon. Last year, I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in a safety culture forum held by the NTSB. When I appeared in front of the board members, I mentioned that collecting the data is becoming easy. It's something that we like talking about. It's something that we do. That's the easy part. But whether it's easy or hard, developing data into information we can use for decision-making is likely more difficult. Then taking that information and gaining useful or actionable knowledge is harder yet. Finally, of course, we want to achieve wisdom that extends beyond what an individual pilot or an employee or the airline itself sees. It might be a stretch, but if we think in terms of our individual roles and think about pooling our corporate and organizational wisdom, then possibly we can produce self-truths, or at least well-established core values in the air safety industry. The individuals on this next panel represent a good cross-section of the airline industry, the International Airline Association, the aircraft manufacturer, a U.S. network airline, and certainly the regulator. Their perspectives are extremely relevant to the task of building effective safety programs from data from employees working within the organization's just culture. So let me introduce them. I'll introduce them each, and then we'll get into it. I'd like to also remind you that their biographies are contained in your programs, and they are impressive biographies to say the least. First, we have Captain Kevin Hiatt, Senior Vice President for Safety and Flight Operations, International Air Transport Association. Next, Captain Craig Hoskins, Vice President, Safety and Technical Affairs, Airbus Americas. Captain Paul Morell, Vice President, Safety, Security, and Environment, American Airlines. Paul is also the industry co-chair for the U.S. Commercial Air Safety Team. And Mr. J. Pardee, Aircraft Certification Service, Federal Aviation Administration. So Kevin, let's go ahead and start. Give us a sense of the international airline community's view on building effective safety programs, and maybe you can relate some differences that you've seen here in the United States with the international counterparts that we're working with.
Great, Chuck. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my first opportunity here in the United States to be reintroduced under my new role as the Senior Vice President of Safety and Flight Operations. I also promised, Chuck, that there wouldn't be a 50 PowerPoint presentation today. There's only just a few slides that I think will definitely bring the point home of what IATA is. And I know all of you have heard IATA, you know what you think you know about us, but just to go back to some of the basics here, we represent over 240 international air carriers. And in that representation, then, part of what we do in the safety and flight operations area is run audit programs, and also we gather a tremendous amount of data. We help each one of our carriers with support where they request it in terms of data that's being gathered. We get it from various sources. We'll get it from the airlines. We get it from the maintenance departments now, and we're getting it from the pilots and some of the other areas throughout the world that are willing to share with us. What we try to do is have a complete coverage of all the operational areas. This also includes ground, flight, and air traffic. And what we're doing now is establishing what would be called an Int'l data warehouse. And it will allow us to run comprehensive analysis and studies on what's happening and obviously what we can do to predict what we can prevent from happening in the future. And also, I want to make sure that everybody understands that we do it in a global and a regional approach. We have 5 regions within IATA worldwide, and then we'll also work with the individual carriers as necessary and as requested. You know, we want to collaborate with all industry stakeholders on all safety initiatives. That's why I'm here today working with ALPA, ALPA, and other organizations to make sure that we collaborate. I think many of you have heard throughout every past presentation that I gave when I was at the Flight Safety Foundation and then just most recently here at IATA that collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. And that is the way we're going to solve some of these issues that we've got facing us right now, such as what we discussed this morning on the safety information protection. When I arrived at the doorstep of IATA in February of this year, I met with my staff, and one of the first things that I laid out was somewhat as a vision. And we all know from this conference today that we're talking about that data is going to be the key to the future of aviation safety. I call it safety version 2.0. We've gone from that basic reactive, proactive, now into that predictive era. And the predictive era is going to let us continue as we move into the next 100 years of commercial flight to keep it as safe as we've accomplished to this point. But there are challenges. If you take a look at what we're talking about today and what's out there in the world, we're talking about individual privacy versus learning from the experiences, just culture, as we're talking about, and proactive reporting, complete and real-time data and information collection, analysis of different sources generating from different vantage points. There are all types of different opinions that come in, and what we have to do is take into account those opinions. We have to take into account the type of data that we're getting. So the challenges are there, and what we have to do is transform, from a proactive, as I said, to a predictive measure as we go forward. I'm going to build this in front of you here. This is our Int'l data warehouse that we've established at IATA. And this has been no small task. As a matter of fact, when we talk about data, we do, Chuck, as you said, we have a wealth of data coming in. It comes in every day. We've got so much data right now that we're not really doing the collection process justice because we're not being able to analyze it further as we should be. But we have inputs with incident reports, accidents, recorded flight data, audit data, maintenance cost data, and ground damage. Now this is outside, or in addition to, I should say, than just the safety area, as we talked about this morning. We've got data coming in now talking about the maintenance costs, the ground damage costs, other things that are much wider. Now this is all within the confines of our organization. Right now, my department within IATA is, as we would say, the gatekeeper. We bring this information in through selected agreements that come from our carriers that entrust us with their data, of which we basically de-identify and start to then do specific trend analysis on areas that we think we should be exploring. And then we'll have a carrier come in, and that carrier may say, but Kevin, you know, what do we need to know in this particular area as a benchmark with our other carriers? And that's where we are very, very effective. But you can see the sources right there, 189 airlines, 200 industry reports, 90 airlines with recorded flight data, 389 airlines with audit data. That's our IOSA program. Not only do we have 241 carriers that are required to have IOSA, we've got about another 150 there that elect to participate in IOSA, even though they may not be eligible to be a member of IATA. So as you go down through and you see all of these types of things in our data warehouse at the moment, we're stacking up data rapidly, as I said, more rapidly than we can ever really start to use, and we're starting to take a look internally at how we can be even more effective. But, you know, over a 3-year history, 2.5 million recorded flights, over 1 million reports on incidents. That's a tremendous amount of data that's flowing in. So how do we take that data and make it even better? If you take a look at the arrows as they go across, you've got the event analysis, you've got contributing factors, proactive measures, audits, regulatory and training, and then that predictive information. On that very small bottom line there, which is somewhat of an eye test, you can take a look at the things that are contributing to that, which are the accidents, the incidents. We have our data from our safety information and trend setting steeds. We have our global data ground damage base, and then our FDA, which is flight data analysis, and FDX, which is flight data sharing and flight data analysis. And then we go over to the weather, actual flights from DDS. Again, all this data is being compiled. Under the proactive measures, we've got IOSA working with SAFA in Europe, ITQI, which is training, evidence-based training, multi-pilot license and training syllabuses. These are all areas that benefit from us getting data. Scheduled flights, SSIM, DDS data, risk assessment modes. Those are all things that we look at in that predictive side. So, you know, going forward with the data is going to be the key to all of our future. So the information sharing benefits, obviously, once we get the comprehensive database established, we conduct more analysis from different vantage points. Share experience made to develop proactive safety measures, improve the auditing, develop and implement, you know, the predictive analysis part of this. Get those safety performance indicators, get those gates, those benchmarks that we know that we need in order to stay out in front of the situation. Support individual safety management systems. We're going to get into that a little bit more, as Chuck had mentioned, with safety management is much broader than just an accident report and accident reporting. Safety management brings in all of these areas that I just discussed in one large basket, and we've got to make sure that with the additional information that we're asking our carriers to provide through safety management, we have some way to process it. And then collaborate on a regional and a global basis. You know, here in the United States, right now we're collaborating with the SIAS and through the Commercial Aviation Safety Team. but all around the world, others are putting together similar programs, and so the vision would be that we bring each one of those programs eventually together. Now, tackle that one in an afternoon session. That's something that's going to come along here in the next year or two, and we're going to have to start to think about it as other regions start to do their own programs, and how we're going to get the common taxonomy and how we're going to get all the common areas that we can collaborate on to make sure that we're addressing the right subject. So we as an industry, as I would say on the airline side, are moving beyond solving our issues in isolation. We need to continue the efforts of collaboration and develop more information sharing. And I'll give you this closing thought there, Chuck, is data will let us look to our industry from all different perspectives, making aviation even more safer than it is. Again, back to data and what we're talking about, protecting it today and how we're going to use it. Thanks, Chuck.
Very good. You know, we often think, and we've heard in the panels this morning, that, you know, that SMS is just an airline issue. But in fact, all interested parties, including the manufacturers, are also very, very tied into safety management and using data to build information. So, Craig, I'm going to hand it over to you. How do you and Airbus do just that?
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chuck. And I just want to say thank you. It's an honor and both humbling to be a part of this panel and participating in this. And I thought about something this morning. When I was a member of the SIS issue analysis team in the A4A Flight Safety Committee, we'd always start out the meeting and we'd say, just remember, there are no liveries and there are no uniforms. And now in this role, I can add to that and say there are no manufacturers either. Because everybody in this room, the people that are watching this, we all share the same passion for safety. And it's evident in the breakout sessions. So, but that just didn't happen overnight. And to kind of give you an idea of where Airbus was about 20 years ago, we just celebrated our 20th Flight Safety Conference this past March. And if you take a look back at the very first one, it was very centric, investigative-centric, where we were shouting out a message, if you will, and then it kind of progressed into listening. And what was interesting with the theme of this previous conference was the theme was built around sharing, because it's not the reactive mode, as Chuck had previously mentioned, where we went from basically the reactive, proactive, predictive piece. So the Airbus product safety process looks a whole lot different now than it did back then. In addition to still having your investigations team, we also have a group there's basically 3 groups, and one of the groups is investigations, the other one is basically safety operations, and it was kind of referenced this morning with one of the panels on the regional aviation safety groups, where we have members in each part of the world working the different issues that affect certain regions. And then the third part of our safety process is basically the data analytics, and that gets now into the proactive/predictive piece. And when you look at it, you look at the product safety process, we're looking at safe aircraft, of course, we're looking at safe airline operations, and then also looking at the air transport system as a whole. And there are challenges that come along with that when you look at it from a holistic approach. When you think of all the variables that are in there, how dynamic operations are, the interfaces between whether it's the airline and the crew, airline, air traffic management, it could be the aircraft and how it blends in. We heard earlier this morning about RNAV off the ground, some of the directed studies that take place. How does all these interfaces come into play? And again, it's a moving target because of the variability and the flexibility that we have. So that's kind of the overall snapshot of that. So what do we do with this? And so you think about the industry participation. I heard Jay mention earlier, you see so many familiar faces and you're like, now what meeting was that I was a part of where we met? And you think about where we participate in the CAST. We participate with the SIS Executive Board, the Executive Steering Committee, with the RAGSPA Pan America group, and we take a look at our participation with issue analysis teams in that area as well. So we're participating now where we're working with MITRE as well and being an active role in also the InfoShare, because there's a lot of data that can be passed back and forth from a manufacturer's point of view. There are lessons, that two-way fold that we can share and also receive data to enhance product safety, if you will, and also be able to take a look at trends that might show precursors, for example, when in production test flights. And we also have a flight data monitoring program as well, where we have other participating airlines sharing data, both from a proactive piece, and then also that we'll share data on a reactive piece as well in the event of an accident or an incident. So all of this put together, being active in the industry, again, like I was mentioning, doesn't happen overnight, but it also is built on trust. And we've heard that theme throughout the day about the just culture. And we talk about, in order to have a safe culture, you have to have one that's reporting, but in order to have the reporting, you need the just. And the trust is a key, because once the trust is broken in any of these agreements, if you will, or even the perception thereof, what has taken us so long, what got us here, will definitely, it would go away very quickly. And that's the important piece of this, where we all maintain the same vision together. So the other part that I think it was Captain Nilsson this morning mentioned too, what do we do about the global outreach? And, we have it today. Captain Cassidy mentioned, how many people are viewing in. But these conferences, I look at our audience at our flight safety conferences, for example, where we have airline operators from all over the world. And you get a very interesting perspective when you have these sharing opportunities. And because, again, we're talking about the different regions where it was mentioned, are there areas of benchmarking that can take place with some of the regional aviation safety groups. There's a lot of strength in that and a lot of knowledge to transfer back and forth. And, partnering with, ICAO, IATA, and others, we're another resource in this kind of this circle of information flow, if you will. So, if you looked at where the Airbus safety program is today, where it was even 10 years ago, it is very focused now on the predictive, proactive piece. So, thank you, Chuck.
Very good. That's very interesting. Paul, along with your role as VP for Safety at American, you're also the CAST industry co-chair. That gives you an ability to look at a lot of safety issues from a couple of different angles. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as how you're using data and gleaning information at a large network airline, one that certainly is evolving. But you can also speak maybe on a larger view industry-wide.
Sure. Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Sean, for having us here, and thanks for putting this together. I came from U.S. Airways as far as the merger. I think everybody knows we're merging with American Airlines. And in that process, as you can well imagine, taking a look at data, looking at risk, mitigating that risk is extremely important. So what we found is both airlines had a very robust SMS program. And so using that SMS as our catalyst and our guiding principle to put the two airlines together is basically helping us through this process. So how does this tie in with these voluntary reporting programs and all this data? As you can well imagine, what we have is, first off, we've been talking today about ASAP mostly, and we've talked a little bit about FOCA, but we also have AQP, Advanced Qualification Program, training program. We also have LOSA, Line Operations Safety Assurance. We have data from a lot of different sources that play into the SMS. So how does that work as far as using this data? Because that's pretty a lot of what we're talking about is using this data. And so one of the things as far as putting an SMS, and a lot of you have SMSs in your airlines right now, and they all look a little bit different. It all depends upon what the airline is like and how it can be used. But one of the things that we found is really important with our SMS is, number one, it's not owned by the safety department. The safety department does not own the SMS. Each operating department owns the SMS. The second part is the way we look at it as far as who runs it, and also how it functions. And the way it functions is, as you well know, it's collaborative. So when we say collaborative, what do you have there? Just like your ASAP program. You have management there, you have labor there, you have you have the FAA there, and through that collaboration, now you can look at all the data. And one of the things we've had in the past, if you think about it, you had your ASAP programs, everybody's doing their job over here, doing a great job. You have your FOCA programs, they're doing a great job. You have your LOSA going over here, they're doing a great job. All these things, and the AQP, the training department, you have to bring all that together in order to look at the total. And this is what we're talking about, is having a lot of data. But in order to get that reporting, we talked about it earlier today, you have to have the just culture. And so one of the things I've learned coming to American Airlines is American Airlines has kind of been out in the forefront with just culture. They are on a trial basis with the FAA for their ASAP programs, and that where it's written into the ASAP program, the just culture. So the question you probably have is how well is it working, and what have we seen from that? And from as an outsider looking in and now part of the inside, it's been very interesting to me. The first thing I noticed is, as far as one of the things we've had trouble with ASAP programs is the trust. And so what the just culture does is I think it really, really helps in the trust side, and I'll explain why. The reason is because when an incident or an ASAP report comes in, it is studied, but what happens is it goes through a decision matrix. And that decision matrix is a matrix that's been trained on the FAA side, it's been trained on the management side, and it's been trained on the labor side. They've all agreed to this matrix and how it works. So as you go through the just culture matrix, at the end of the day, what do you determine? You determine, is it systemic, is it at risk, or is it reckless behavior? And everybody's in agreement with that. The second thing I've learned as part of that is by going through this process, it also helps you start your analysis on what you're going to do. In other words, is it a reckless behavior? Is it systemic? Is it this? It helps categorize it and get the focus in the right direction. So that's where we've seen that the just culture has really helped a whole bunch. So as you can well imagine, as we're going through our integration, we're going to be looking at all that data, validating how well the integration is going, and going from there. But the other side, and what Chuck asked me to talk about, is, now I have to turn the hats around, but it's not really turning the hat around. And that is, how is all this data, all this information that we have, we share it, as most of you do too, with ASIAS, and why is that beneficial to us, and how does it help us as an airline? And Jay will talk a lot about it. I'm not going to take Jay's thunder away from him, but as you guys can well imagine, the first part of ASIAS is it's going to help the NAS. It's going to help all of us by fixing things that we as an individual airline don't have. But there are other parts of the ASIAS that help us too. Next one is InfoShare, and we have InfoShare. How many we have? Almost 800?
825.
825 registered, and I think 795 attended InfoShare this last one. And as you guys well know, I'm sure most of you go to InfoShare. There's a lot of good information that, again, is data and is issues that get shared with the whole industry and with the regulator and a lot of other people. The second thing on the SIAS is that we see as an airline is that we can benchmark. And benchmarks, I think, are extremely important. So we can go in there and we can take my own airline and we can say, how am I doing relative to the aggregate of everybody else? And that's extremely important, because you might think you're doing really well, and maybe that's not the case. Or you can look at other issues that other aggregate have and say, you know what, I'm going to a new airport. What can I learn there? So there's a lot of benefit from that data for the airline on its side. So the other thing that we have that's happened with the SIAS is we have an MOU with the NTSB. And so, you take a look at that, and Dana is going to be here, I think, on the next panel, right, Dana Schultz? And she'll probably talk to that more than I will, so I'm not going to steal her thunder. But the benefit to us as an industry, us as labor, and us as manufacturers, is by having the NTSB have some access. When I say access, it's controlled, but having some access to this enables them to take a look at, if you think about it, all they're looking at is one accident in this vacuum, in this void. That's what they're looking at. So for them to get a better picture of is what they're seeing systemic or not, if what they're seeing is something that there are other issues out there that they're not aware of because they have just limited data. Those are the types of things that can help us as an industry in two ways. Number one is getting better recommendations and also good recommendations from the NTSB. So all of the ASIAS data, as you can well imagine, now supports CAST. And so CAST, Commercial Aviation Safety Team, is taking that analysis, doing their own analysis, and coming up with safety enhancements. And as Peggy talked about earlier, from 1998 to 2008, there was an 83% increase or decrease in the risk, fatality risk. Our goal now by 2025 is to cut that down another 50%. And as you take a look at what our rate is now and to cut that another 50%, we got a lot of work ahead of us, and Jay's the guy that's doing a lot of that work. But that's what CAST is doing. So one of the things we need to do, we talked about information sharing, Chuck. One of the things that we're working at in CAST is to get the word out. If you think about it, CAST gets these safety enhancements, and how do they get it out to the field? What they do is they have it published, and people can see it. And we have InfoShare. One of the things we've done at InfoShare is we have a Director of Safety meeting. In the Director of Safety meeting, we've gone out to the Directors of Safety and asked them to look at their portfolio and asked them to look at these safety enhancements. Another thing that's going to be coming out to the airlines, and it's a voluntary, is web ops. There's going to be an S400 web ops. And they're going to start with, is it six? Six of the safety enhancements, and ask voluntarily for the airlines to go in there and say yes or no or whatever as far as have they implemented these safety enhancements. That'll expand over, what, every three months?
Every 6.
Every 6. So over 2 years, we'll get out to about 24 of these safety enhancements. So if you think about that, what are we trying to do? We're trying to do 2 things. The first one is to make people aware that the safety enhancements are there voluntarily. And the second thing is for CAST, we don't have a good feel for how many of them have been implemented. So we use a SIAS to look and try to validate how effective these safety enhancements are. And so now we get a better idea how many have been implemented. So if you take a look at it from an airline level to an industry level to a regulator level, all these voluntary programs are extremely important and feed into SIAS, which feed into CAST and enhance the safety of the whole system.
Very good. Very interesting, Paul. I'm sure we'll have some questions on some of your points. Well, as Paul alluded to, there's basically 3 things that you hear in the same sentence when you're talking about industry and FAA work towards safety enhancements. One is CAST, second is SIAS, and the third one is Jay Pardee. So, Jay, as you know, many people in the audience are interested in the FAA's perspectives, and certainly we heard from the administrator and the associate administrator this morning, and the director of flight standards, about their support, and certainly I sense that they take this very, very seriously. But I'm interested in the data collection, the information sharing, and how that helps the FAA really get their work done and their responsibilities.
Chuck, thank you. And I think that third thing was actually InfoShare on that flow chart as opposed to Jay Pardee. But right. And I think go back to a comment Tony Fazio made earlier. I think the administrator has high on his agenda the desire and goal that the FAA would adopt a risk-based decision-making process. I think SIAS, CAST, InfoShare aligns with that view and that vision very nicely, Chuck. I don't see it that there's any conflict whatsoever. The ability to maybe one comment I would make about forensic studies. I think we're not leaving the forensic accident investigation or hull loss study behind us. In fact, we study it in CAST, whether it be international, worldwide, wherever that may occur. And then we look over our shoulder, frankly, into a SIAS to see, do we even have any of that vulnerability that we can detect in our own domestic operations? But certainly, as Kevin was pointing out, adding a proactive and a predictive capability, I think all 3 of those are important ways to look at the next generation of SMS systems and safety management systems together. Wanted to comment, maybe it was Craig or Paul that had mentioned it earlier, but having many voluntary data sources available to SIAS and the commercial aviation safety team, I think we're finally in a position. I was trying to reflect when we had started this activity. I guess Paul, the CAST began in fall of 1997, and the SIAS is 6.5 years old. But currently we have the ability to look at the data sources Paul was mentioning, FOQA, ASAP, ASAP from cabin maintenance dispatch, et cetera, as well as flight, ATSAP, a similar program from all of the controllers, and all the radar surveillance data available to the FAA in the United States, ASDX, TRACON, all the en route center data. But the message here is that we're able now to look at problems that are identified either by flight crew members or InfoShare or that we see in our data and characterize them from the perspective of what do the flight crew members perceive as the safety threat and how did the controller see that particular incident and what is the aircraft recording in DFDR data. I think bringing those multiple sources together has brought us much closer to being able to really understand, from a 360-degree perspective, in a more robust sense, what were the problems, and not only what were the problems, but what were the contributing factors and the precursor to those problems and contributing factors. And I think we are much closer to being able to utilize that information in a manner that lets us design, as Paul was describing, voluntarily adopted by consensus safety enhancements, but being able to have a much better understanding of what the problems were, how to develop a much more tightly focused and effective safety solution as opposed to a broad, frankly, maybe resource-intensive solution. Paul mentioned metrics. I think having the ability in the current data to identify not only accidents, problems, and contributing factors and precursors, CAST has built metrics with the help of ASIAS for many of the basic safety barriers that give us insight into how effective are the mitigations that all of the parties who are members of CAST and ASIAS have adopted. We can identify the frequency of TAWs, TCAS RAs, unstabilized approach, loss of control, subthreshold rolls. Craig mentioned RNAV departures, arrivals, star ops. But I think we're in a position finally where we're able to leverage data, come up with a very tight, focused safety solution, and then measure the frequency of that particular problem and judge our performance. Not only counting the occurrence of the problem or penetration of a safety barrier, but geographically understanding where the hotspots are and the severity of those particular challenges. I want to pick up on one of Paul's other points. If we keep doing things the way we've done it in the past, why would we expect anything to be different? We have an opportunity through CAST and working with an activity we call OAPM, Optimization of Airspace Programs in the Metroplex. It's a tough acronym, but here's an opportunity for CAST with the help of ASIAS in a de-identified aggregate protected fashion to identify where the tactical safety threats are in the U.S. NAS, to give that information to the OAPM team, which is redesigning the nation's airspace in those 13 metroplexes, give them the tools that we developed to detect those problems, and then provide the safety assurance data to them at the end of the airspace redesign to act as a baseline and a comparison for how well we redesign the nation's airspace. Maybe a couple of other brief comments. RAGSPA has been mentioned a few times. I think we're very proud of that activity, but we found a way using the metrics that we developed in a consensus fashion and in a de-identified, protected way with the same governance we use in CAST and ASIAS to share with the Regional Aviation Safety Group Pan America our experience flying into their 22 airports. They have agreed to adopt 13 of the CAST safety enhancements specifically tailored to the kinds of fatality risk we see in that region. And I think in discussing with Paul and Terry McFinnish just a little bit earlier, we've seen a tremendous improvement, over a 50% improvement in our unstabilized approach experience in the Pan American 22 airports. I mean, that is a benefit of leveraging and analyzing data that we had not even anticipated when we built ASIAS and CAST. I think benchmarks have already been mentioned. Maybe one last comment that I'd like to address. So we help the airspace redesign teams by using our de-identified protected performance metrics. We also conduct another look-forward activity called ATLAS, and God knows what that acronym is at the moment, Paul, I forget, but it's an aviation team looking forward for, I think, future safety system effects. But here we're looking outward now, 3 to 5 years, 10 to 15 years. What are the kinds of changes coming from next gen? What are the kinds of changes due to demographics or changes in business practices or equipage? And how do they affect the specific CAS safety portfolio of 89 SEs? Trying to make sure that we are aware of future changes coming to us either by virtue of next gen, and how well is our portfolio prepared for those changes? And I think I should probably stop at that point, Chuck, although I'd like to brief 10 or 12 Tableau files, but we'll leave it at that.
We'll leave that for next time, Jay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We spent a lot of our time talking, you know, about the FAA's responsibility for oversight. And, you know, we forget that there's also an arm of the FAA that actually has to do, you know, there's this arm of it that has to do things like airspace modernization and looking at text. By the way, I'm getting some data right now. So and I think that's important, that particularly with next gen, that data is crucial, and I appreciate you bringing that out. So we'd like to start thinking about some questions. I've got a couple to get to maybe start the discussion. I'm going to put this first one on Paul, but I think all four of you should be able to speak to it pretty well. Once you have a program, how do you implement the change? And we've talked about getting all of this data, but how do you actually take it and do something with it? And I'd be interested in your perspectives on that. And I'll start with you, Paul, and then see if...
Well, once you've identified an issue or you're going to identify change, the first thing you do is a safety risk assessment. So through your safety risk assessment, what you're doing is identifying the hazards, and from those hazards, you're identifying the risks. And from those risks, you determine what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and what mitigations you're going to put into effect. And it's not just a single person doing it, as you can well imagine, depending on what the issue is. It could be from many disciplines and many people. And then from that, you basically go out there and then do your education, your training, and then you do your validation to ensure that those mitigations work. So that's the process that we would use to implement change.
What's your take on it, Kevin?
It's a pretty quick process.
Takes a little longer.
He rattled that off in just about 1 minute, but that's about a year's worth of work in some airlines. But I would go key off of that, the safety risk assessment, but also chuck back to the education part of it. Take the data that you've learned, go back and assess what you've got in place there, which is what the air carrier normally does, and then see where you can make those changes, which comes through educating your instructors or educating your program directors, and then moving it on to educating the pilot or the ground personnel or whatever area is affected. But that education piece is the part that's the one that really has to be implemented.
Right. Craig, from a manufacturer standpoint?
Before I answer that question, I wanted to build on the ATLAS, because there are not enough acronyms with CAST.
Right.
So the ATLAS, the aviation team looking ahead at safety, it's kind of like a think tank, if you will, and it's, imagine just being a creative thinker and talking about items, no boundaries of what will the airspace look like 10, 15 years down the road? What should we start thinking about, whether, it's UAS systems, the sky is the limit, no pun intended, but that's what that team is all about. Coming back to your question, Chuck, and I'll try to do this one in 30 seconds, even though it takes a lot longer, especially in different time zones. But so what happens when the data, these data streams come in as a manufacturer? To Paul's point, they're not decisions that are made in a vacuum, but it goes through a process where the product safety committee takes a look at it, and then they do the risk assessment, and if it looks like it's something that needs to be elevated for a decision, then it goes up to the executive level with a product safety board. So it's a very formalized process. That way the decisions are based on risk, if you will, from the data that's feeding it. So that's, in a soundbite, how we take a look at it.
Sure. Jay, any difference in the way the FAA, and come back to your discussion on implementing next gen in that, does the FAA take a different approach in being an organization that has to take data and implement change? Is there any difference in the way the FAA does that?
Chuck, I think it's very similar, actually. And I was thinking of the process we go through in CAS to fully vet a safety enhancement. We build a detailed implementation plan. There are individual outputs in each implementation plan. The FAA is identified frequently as having roles and responsibilities and actions required, frankly, to take actions that fall within their purview or to support other follow-on activities. But again, all of the studies are participated and represented in all the organizations who are members. And the role of a team member is to keep your home organization informed. We bring that proposed solution and the supporting data, Chuck, back in front of CAST. We spend time briefing all the member organizations, the associations, A4A, RAA, NACA. Internally, I brief all of our FAA divisions, air traffic, flight standards, airports, flight deck procedures and technologies. I think we all look at our capability, what's required of us, how it fits into our business plan, and go through that full vetting activity. The FAA commits, just as the OEMs and labor organizations and airline members at the table. And as you know from CAST meetings, first order of business is to review in a voluntary fashion where all of the members sit who had outputs to implement a safety solution. Are you green, red, or yellow? What steps have you taken? What progress have you made? And although it's not mandatory, I find that a pretty effective means to ensure we all do what's required of us. I think the FAA responds to the data the same way all the OEMs and the same way the organizations in CAS do, Chuck. Supported all the way up through Administrator Herter.
Very good. Well, we're waiting for questions for you. I'm going to keep feeding on. And I came up with this question because it was actually interesting from the panel this morning. And I'll just coin a phrase, data pileup. We collect lots of data. We've gotten very good at that. But now we've got to move that data forward into information. If we're going to keep a just culture going, we've got to share with our employees and the people that are reporting and helping us provide for that data that data is actually going to be used. And, one of the questions this morning raised concern. If data is laying around, there is a certain amount of risk in data that is not constantly going into the engine in the metaphor I used. Do you see that as, I'll go just down the line here. Do you see that as a true risk, or is that just a matter of we don't have enough analysts to get the data refined and into action that we need to take? I'll start with you, Kevin.
2 points. One is the fact that we do have a tremendous amount of data coming in, and if we don't get the information back to those who are providing, as you just said, we run a very high risk of people just saying, oh, well, I put something in at my airline and I got no response back, and so therefore, why do I want to continue to contribute? What good is it helping me? They may not have that full picture of what is going to be done with the data, and their individual case may not be used directly. But I remember from my former life at Delta Airlines where we would fill out what's called a crew operational report, and it was incumbent upon the department that was taking in that report to just respond back to the individual that we've got the data, thank you very much for your contribution, and we'll use it effectively. The second part of that risk is I will definitely say that we've got a tremendous amount of data coming in, and we're going to have to explore new ways to process the data not only in what we do in this particular region, but if we bring more data in from all over the world, we're going to have to take a look at how we get common taxonomy and how we're going to apply it to those different areas.
Yeah, you know, I think what you're describing is we got to widen the bandwidth,
More
so
bandwidth,
to speak,
right?
because we're getting lots of data. A lot of it's being reported automatically. Craig, your thoughts on that?
I'd like to echo what Kevin had mentioned. When I look at it from our perspective, we've got the safety team where we literally had to ramp up a couple more people because if you don't provide the feedback, it's going to shut off.
Right.
And also on the flight test side and the flight ops, building up the flight data monitoring as well, staffing there was increased along with technology in doing the data mining because that basically both programs started with one person, but it's not sustainable like that. So it's been a combination of both having individuals put in place and then also what type of software search engines, data mining engines are being used at this point to provide that feedback.
Right. Paul, you and Jay maybe can approach it from certainly a CAS standpoint, but data pileup, for lack of another term, how do you see us dealing with that if that is in fact an issue from an ASIA standpoint and a CAS standpoint?
Well, I've talked to it from an airline and an ASIA standpoint. First, on an airline standpoint, a lot of the data that we see, what we call pile-up, is really, if you think about it, an awful lot of the things is trend analysis to see where we are, what we're doing, are we in a positive or a negative trend. So that's the first part. The second part is that part of our problem we have is trying to know what to look at. And I'll give you a perfect example. So one of the things we were looking at was rotation rate on takeoff. By looking at that, we discovered something that we weren't even thinking about. And that is we discovered we had a one-off kind of events. When I say one-off, we're talking, maybe 3 or 4 a year type of thing, where right after liftoff, instead of raising the gear, the flaps came up. Not a good place to be with the flaps up. Something we didn't even know existed out there. And so one of the problems you have with all this data is where to look. What are you looking for? And one of the things, and Jay can kind of go on into this, is we're in the point now where an awful lot of where these accidents are happening are one-off type of things. They're rare events that happen out there, but they're rare events that go bad. Or maybe they're just precursors, and that's what Jay was talking about before. They're precursors to these one-off events. So we are trying in ASIAS to discover what are these precursors. So that's where Jay was talking. I'll let you go into, Jay, as far as the roll-offs and different types of things that we're looking for as far as high-altitude stalls are concerned. So being able to know how and where to look in the data is extremely difficult, and that's another thing that we need to share as an industry.
I'm thinking, Chuck, if my boss Peggy Gilligan were here, she'd caution. I think we're learning, we're doing more than walking, and we're even jogging at a certain point in time, but I think that's still a work in progress. But back to Paul's point, I think we're doing pretty well keeping up with data. We keep a running 3-year trend, as you know, for all of the key CAS metrics. And that includes, I think there were 11.5 million FOQA flights, 168,000 ASAP reports, 75 million radar tracks, et cetera. We're probably never more than 2-3 months behind on FOQA analysis for trends. But the point Paul was making, it's like there are an awful lot of numbers in the phone book, but only a few are very important. We've kind of looked at, from all the years of CAS being in existence since 97, put together kind of a glossary, if you will, of undesired aircraft states, those that have historically, whether we change technology or the NAS, seem to be repetitive, recurring ways we would suffer catastrophic failure or lose an airplane. I think if you put the blinders on for a minute and say, we don't care how that state occurred or how that precursor was detected, those kinds of precursors merit our attention first. Paul was sharing an example. We recently completed an airplane state awareness study. Loss of attitude awareness or loss of energy state awareness, knowing that loss of control events, subthreshold rolls, large angular rolls, are an indicator. When you see a 35 or 45 degree roll, we automatically pick those out of the data at this point through automated routines. Seeing repetitive stall warnings in a particular chuck, if they're not followed by a reduction in AOA, not knowing how that situation occurred, just key in on those highly safety significant events. Paul mentioned, and we currently have a misconfiguration study underway in a SIAS. I think for whatever reason, if we see an attempt to take off with zero flaps or flaps in motion on takeoff, or an inadvertent retraction shortly after rotation, again, historically we know that's an undesired aircraft state, and we began to look as part of our vulnerability discovery activity, try and bubble those to the top.
Very good. Okay, we have some questions. I'll go to the floor first, and when you come to the mic, if you would state your name and your organization, and I understand we also have a text message coming, but go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'm Ted McCaughan, manager of SMS for flight operations at United Airlines. First, I'd like to thank ALPA for putting this on. This is a fantastic group and a lot of information flowing around here. You mentioned data getting into the system and into the machine, and I like to look at the machine as SMS being a big part of that machine and utilizing that data. And ASAP programs are a huge piece of that, getting into that machine. Do you envision a time where MOUs will specifically be inclusive of SMS in the process, or do you find that ASAPs need to be fundamentally independent in a different system almost to keep it independent and keep it as an objective part of the process?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm going to just pitch the beach ball up and see who hits it first. So, Jay, I'm looking at you. Hit it first.
There needs to be one more chair at the end of this row. But I think whatever we do, we shouldn't lose the value of ASAP submissions. I don't know that it has to be separate or rolled into SMS. I think there are a number of data sources that can be part of SMS. I think Tony commented as part of the administrator's reauthorization, or the reauthorization language the FAA administrator received from Congress. You know, we have the capability to provide additional protections under the SMS program. Whether there's some benefit in viewing ASAP in that light, Chuck, I'm really not sure. But I think we look at ASAP as a robust program today. It has Part 193 protection. I think as a SIAS uses it, it retains that Part 193 protection. As the products that use ASAP and FOCA come to CAST, CAST has its own Part 193 protection. I think it's always going to be part of the lifeblood of a SIAS and CAST. I think it can be enriched when combined with SMS data sources beyond ASAP.
You know, I heard another thing in the question, and Paul, I'll look to you, maybe you can address this, is we currently develop letters of authorization and memorandums of understanding. Is the day coming to where that will be a homogeneous process where they'll all look the same to the point to where we just put it in? Or do we need to maintain individuality in those types of agreements?
My own personal opinion on that is that I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be the same. They should be identical. I don't think it needs to be part of the SMS, and the reason is because SMS isn't just ASAP programs, and it's not ASAP programs don't apply to all the different areas where SMS covers. There are all kinds of other data sources for that. But back to your statement there, Chuck, I do think it's, if we could get there, I think it would be very good to have them homogeneous.
Kevin, Craig, anything?
Well, I'll take the beach ball this way now. And I agree with both what Paul and Jay have said, but I also believe back to the ASAP part alone, it's working well, and I believe that with the other factors that we can program in or take into account along with ASAP, it would even be more enriching as far as what happened and what were some of the external parameters around it. So I think within the SMS basket itself that there's more that could be gained by pairing it up with something else, other information.
I think just from my personal experience, it was a very good question. But we have to kind of keep it in the context too that, FOQA, ASAP, et cetera, are voluntary programs.
Right.
So it would be tough to require one of those to be part of, but holistically, it's another one of the data streams, information streams for a well-functioning SMS. But we have to remember that voluntary part before the program.
Very good. I want to go to the text question, and then we'll come back to the floor.
Yeah, Paul, you alluded to one of these before, but when you talked about the flap retraction right after takeoff. But one of the questions is how specifically does a large airline like American use the huge amount of data to identify causal factors and precursors?
Well, it's based, just like we've talked about before, it's taking the data, analyzing the data. In our ASAP program, what we've been able to do is, since we do have a huge amount of ASAP coming in, what we do is we prioritize it, we risk it. So we have one section that's low risk and dealing with the low risk ones, and then we have another section that's dealing with the high risk ones. And we think that's extremely important in the sense that you don't want the high risk ones to get all just, intermixed with everything else, and then you miss it. And therefore you can put your resources to the higher risk areas than you do the lower risk. So we prioritize, I would say, would be the way I would answer that question.
Test. This is kind of novel being over on this side of the event here. So I think the beach ball is going to kind of migrate more towards your side there, Jay and Paul. So let me start out with my perspective from somebody who sits on the NAC subcommittee and is very heavily involved in looking at performance metrics to demonstrate the performance of all these next-gen programs that we're involved with. We were kind of discussing some of the ways that we get at some of the performance metrics, and you mentioned OAPM. And one of the performance metrics that we're trying to establish is fuel savings, right? More efficient routings and arrival and departure flows that are kind of part of the whole Metroplex operations. And we're kind of joking how what we really wanted to do is take a SIAS, take away the S, safety, put in a P, performance, and create something kind of called a PIAS. But it raises a really important issue here. How do we preserve the purity of these kind of safety-centric metric systems and not allow them to migrate too far into being used for establishing performance metrics? Does that kind of make sense? Because when you look at fuel burn, you can look at it from a safety standpoint, you can look at it from an efficiency standpoint, but when you change the safety for performance, you take away a lot of those data protections and other aspects of it.
Yeah, do you want to start first?
No, it's yours, Jay.
So, and by the way, what was that acronym again? That had a ring to it. PSIAS or PSIAS. But honestly, we've begun to have those kind of conversations. I think you can do both. Honestly, I think a well-designed safety solution actually can have an efficiency gain as part of that particular activity. We've begun looking at that, I think, more closely, looking at some of the Metroplex designs. Can we reduce TCAS RAs, but is the T route to do that going to be a problem from a fuel burn perspective? Or can we pay attention to the efficiency goals as well as safety? I think you can look at it as well if we can solve some of the causes of TAWS alerts and go-rounds and TCAS RAs and having to fly the escape maneuvers, avoid some of the fuel burns, et cetera, associated with those, where you're vectored out and rejoin the arrival stream. I think we actually do benefit fuel burn and efficiencies at the same time. I think there's some room for growth there. I would caution there is one minor change necessary to the MOU to let us look at fuel burn. We'd have to, Paul, make a small change to how the IAT views the MOU in terms of do we look at airline fuel burn statistics. Currently we don't, as we're restricted to safety. Doesn't mean we can't, but I think we need to talk our way through it. We're actually paying attention to it now, honestly. When we look at the solutions for airspace redesign, not only can you reduce TAWS alerts and unstabilized approaches and TCAS RAs, but can you do it via a T route that doesn't take somebody to Mexico and back, and it isn't going to be economically feasible? So I think we're getting closer, and maybe it is pious.
You know, this discussion, Sean's question actually is a very, very interesting one. As we peel the layer of the information that we're getting, we're coming up with more questions and broadening what we can do with the information. I think it's important to take it very slow and that we not be necessarily overwhelmed with, hey, this is great, we ought to be looking at this, but we need to have those kinds of discussions because we started here as using this for safety information. And there is certainly some value, particularly in a fuel burn analysis and looking at the efficiencies in the system. But I think we have to be careful, and I think CAST and the SIAS both understand that.
Before Paul responds, one thought I didn't mention, Chuck, was I think CAST and the SIAS have intentionally had a separation of church and state, if you will.
Right.
You know, Sean, in order to preserve, I think, excellence in analytical capability, a SIAS doesn't design mitigations, but it characterizes the problem and provides the data to go along with it, as well as sharing that back with the airline members. But mitigation is solely the province of the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, and there's excellence in mitigation design. I think as part of the vetting with all the associations, the OEMs, and the organizations, we do look at, do we have a business case that goes along, Chuck, with safety?
Kevin, you had
I was just going to say, but Chuck, my best Richard question, but Chuck, what about the international community? You know, we're talking CAST and SIAS here. We've got an entire global community out there, and I'll just throw this out on the floor that the air carriers themselves are coming back and saying, we really like what you're doing with all this data, but now they're asking us to analyze the data for more than just the safety issues. And so it does have an exponential way of getting more bang for the buck for this data coming in. Back to what we're saying here, we need to be careful, very measured on how we're doing it, and that's probably another whole panel discussion on another whole day, but just another perspective.
No, it is. Craig?
Chuck, if I may. Sean, your question triggered another thought, and just looking at this from purely a safety professional perspective for a moment, bringing it a little bit closer to home, to your own organizations, your own airlines, this setup also happens because we have all this data coming in, and you know you've got the folk with geniuses with the 50-pound brains, and all of a sudden you get, hey, can you take a look at what our ground power unit hookup times are? What's our one-engine taxi rates going out, going in? And so you kind of see this program that's primarily designed for safety start to morph a little bit out into the operation. And I think, again, it goes back to this trust piece. If, for example, there's one station that has longer ground power hookup times than others, you're hoping, that data is not used in a punitive way or even has the perception of the punishment, because that too, the intention might be good, but the execution could be devastating. So just a thought.
Yeah, no, good point. Paul, do you have anything you want to add on that? Been all set. Good. Yes, sir.
I'm Brian Moynihan from Alaska Airlines, and going to these info shares and having a lot of good conversations with MITRE on the big data. One of the things I've seen is you literally do have rocket scientists and statisticians who are able to use statistics to take this big data and take meaningful results from it, and also draw conclusions. One of the crazy things then is when we come back locally, what we're doing is we're looking at our airline and everybody and their individual properties, are a smaller subset of that, and a lot of times in these meetings I go to, we seem to be tackling and analyzing this data more with abacuses, and the favorite thing they do is just they make a chart and they do trend lines and stuff, and there's so much more richness that can be applied using just the very same analytical techniques that you're using nationally. And I'm just wondering, are there ways, is there a workshop, is there something that we can do where we can take what we're already doing with the big data set and try to help translate that down a little better. I know the dashboard has some of that, but maybe even more with our internal proprietary data sets to do better analyses at the local level. So, that makes sense.
Jay?
So just chatting with Paul, I think we've seen more and more of that request, and more operators have asked, the dashboard is fine, and thank you for the Tableau file. We actually prefer to display it in a different way for our safety board or our management structure. Can you provide, as either a CSV file or an Excel file, and can you let us chew that particular data with our own analytical tools? And I think we've agreed to do that, where if you want to take back the subset that would apply to your particular operator, I think we can make that happen.
And I think I'm more trying to generalize for the specific level and just say, are there basic statistical tenets that you all have already worked out that could be generalized across the group? Because really we are using subsets and we are still trying to draw the same kind of information off a smaller data set that would help, because really, quite frankly, a lot of times locally we're just taking arbitrary ideas, and most of the things I see that come from our internal analysis is such simple math that it doesn't leverage what we really do already have. I mean, outside of just trying to get another tool sent to us, actually, I think the concepts can be generalized across all the properties, so you can say if you try to apply these tools locally, that's how you do it. And I hope I'm making sense what I'm trying to do there.
In fact, can we get you to come to the next IAT meeting and really help us out a little bit?
Seriously, because if you think about SIAS, when we talked about the benchmarks, we talk about the data, we talk about the airline being able to use it. To be able to use the analytics and the things that we're talking about at the airline level, I think is a great idea. So we need.
Because we're not. I don't.
Yeah. Well, we need to. Let's go offline and we need to talk and determine how we can look into that.
Can use your help.
Yeah. You have an action item, Brian. So we have another text message.
Yeah, this question is for Kevin. Are the programs that we're talking about here getting traction internationally?
Well, within our set group of airlines, some of the programs are getting a lot of traction internationally, and we're seeing more carriers sign up. I didn't show another slide out of respect for Chuck not showing slides, but in the collaboration area, we've got EASA right now in Europe signing an MOU with an air carrier to allow that air carrier through us to divulge their information for safety purposes, not anything punitive, but it's a big step in that region of the world to allow data to come outside of what we would say our closed protection is at IATA to be used for that safety entity, such as what is being done here in the United States. We see that as the baby steps to moving forward. So, yeah, we're seeing progress.
Jay has something.
Go ahead, Jay.
Could Kevin, and I think that's an important point. It fits very nicely, Kevin, too, with the second goal and objective of the commercial aviation safety team, to not just reduce the U.S. domestic fatal accident rate, but to reduce worldwide fatal accident rates. So I think there are very much our outreach objective would be to, share our common taxonomy. We've already, I think, partnered with ICAO. There's a CAST ICAO common taxonomy. We share de-identified aggregate information with Regional Aviation Safety Group Pan America. Same for the Asian Pacific RAST. I think where there are opportunities for us to further partner and help internationally with sharing our taxonomy, the fatality risk Pareto as we understand it, the problems and solutions that CAS has identified, I think that would be something we could help with.
I think,
help facilitate that.
I agree, and IATA is very fortunate to be part of the observer status there, which we value a lot, and Flight Safety Foundation is also part of that too, to spread that international global, as we would say, outreach to push this even further, and we'll continue that along with your international, as we would say, directives to make it even bigger.
Very good. One thing, part of what we're trying to accomplish today is link just culture to the quality of data that we get. And I think everybody here agrees that, and we all probably have our individual views of what just culture really means. I want to go back to a comment that Mark Millen made this morning, or an observation that he shared, and it's congruent with an observation from one of Paul's counterparts a couple weeks at CAST, in that there are differences in reporting rates and from various divisions within many organizations. In flight ops, we've had NASA, ASRS, and now at the airline level, we're at a SIAS. Both Mark and this VP of Safety mentioned that we're getting a much higher quantity of information provided because, what we perceive, hopefully, is that we have a just culture, that we want the organization to use that information and take note of some hazards that are being reported. Whereas in another division, the reporting rates are very low. A matter of fact, they're almost one-for-one reporting about incidents that could potentially lead to FAR violation or certificate action. So my question is can we measure just culture, the concept of just culture, by looking at the ratio of reporting versus the incidents? And should we look at it from a macro organizational level, or should we assess just culture purely at the division level? And I guess I'll start with you, Paul, because that's probably closer to what you're dealing with.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. If you take the different divisions or cultures that you're talking about, if you take maintenance and you compare it to flight, they're completely two different worlds as far as what I can see. And so first off, ASAP started in the flight, as you guys well know. And on the flight, pilot is out there and he knows he made a mistake, but not everybody else does know he made a mistake. And he goes out there and he reports it through his ASAP, and that's just the way he does business now. So it's been a way of doing business. You go in the maintenance, and in the maintenance, many times, the maintenance doesn't realize they've made a mistake until after the fact, so then they're reporting it, and then they're giving, through the ASAP, we're getting more information. So it's a different type of dynamic, number one. Number two is what we saw at American Airlines. As far as the reporting rate with the just culture, we saw on the pilot side, it was an appreciable difference that we could tell, but on the maintenance side, it increased substantially. So it does have a difference. Now, as far as equating a just culture with incident versus reporting, I really don't know. We'd have to do some studies on that to see if there is a correlation.
Craig, what do you think? I mean, if certainly from a manufacturer, you have different divisions and different organizational structures. Do you see Airbus as measuring or analyzing just culture going down to the division level, or do they take a sort of a global level and say, hey, we, Airbus, have just culture?
It's a very good question, and it's more in the global sense because just the physical location, if you will, where everything's kind of spread out, and each division does their own thing, but there may be multiple activities within that division, so each one has a little bit different reporting structure, if you will. But I do want to come back to a quick question when you take a look at just kind of from a previous life as well. Is if you have an event, and it's a good litmus test to see if the culture is outcome-based or is it really a just culture-based. And if you think about one of the items that we're working on right now is kind of a redesign, if you will, or safety enhancements for fan cowls, for example, on how they latch. And it put basically another line of defense in there for preventing fan cowl loss separation in flight. So if you have an event, you have to ask yourself, how are the pilots treated with that event while it's under investigation compared to the maintenance folks? Is one group being removed pending investigation with pay? And is the other one being removed pending investigation without pay, waiting to see what the outcome is going to be to determine whether there's going to be back pay or not? It's a very good litmus test to see. and check on the own culture as well.
Yeah. Kevin, I'd be interested in your thoughts from the international perspective.
International perspective, there's different air carriers all over the world that have different rules that they actually operate by. But let's take it one step even higher. Let's go back to the culture of who's running the airline itself. The CEO or the CFO or the COO, those are the men and the board driving the culture of the air carrier itself, which then, as we would say, cascades down to all these operating departments. And so if you've got a carrier that is definitely focused only on the bottom line and is doing only what's absolutely required of them, therefore that just culture is going to be affected. Whereas you take other carriers in the world internationally that have no monetary constraints, so to say, or any other types of constraints that would prevent them from developing that ideal carrier, now you've got someone that can develop a just culture, and it will then cascade down through the rest of that carrier in a way that's a positive instead of a negative.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Almost done. The reason I asked that is I have one more point I'd like to make.
You have the floor, Paul.
Okay. One more point I'd like to make is you notice all day today we've been talking about data. Data. What can we do with data? How can we use data for safety? And Kevin just brought something up that I kind of just wanted to leave in everybody's minds, and that is basically the culture. And when we talked about culture, we talked about a just culture, but there are other safety cultures that make up an airline. And we have to make sure that what we don't do is just focus on data. Data is only one of our tools. We have a lot of tools in our toolbox, and if we just focus on data, we're going to miss the boat.
Yeah. Now, I think that puts an exclamation point on this, is that data is just but the springboard. We got to move forward from it. So please join me in thanking our panel for what I thought was a very, very good discussion.
Well, thanks so much for that presentation. I think Paul's comments on data were absolutely spot on. And my apologies for my evil twin who just showed up in the audience there to ask a question. I will not let that happen again, I promise. So,
He's not allowed to do that.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take our last break of the day. I invite you to recharge your coffee cups, grab a snack, and then we'll see you back here in your seats at 3:15.